So as I started doing some research on the history of the Bible, I found it extremely interesting. It's very compelling, and it's a very controversial subject. I found there's a variety of camps and a variety of different stories, so I'm just going to give a general synopsis about how the history of the Bible applies to this narrative. And really, if you think about it, if you look through the history of the Bible, which I kind of knew going into it, it's a book that has changed forms and changed content many times. So it's important to remember that the Bible itself was not written by Jesus. It passed through a variety of conduits, Jesus' disciples, various members of his original 12 disciples, and St. Paul. And St. Paul, if you remember, he was a Jewish soldier who was in charge of slaughtering Christians, and he was on his way on the road to Damascus, and he had a spiritual awakening. And he was knocked from his horse by God, and he had this spiritual experience. And more than any other disciple, and this I'm sure is controversial within the Christian community, he was responsible for building and creating the Christian church the way it is today. He had a lot of influence on the Christian church, and some of his works are included in the Bible, and he had never physically met Jesus Christ. So it's important to know, even in this early phase of the Christian teachings, part of it came through, or all of it came through, a variety of conduits, other parties, who had to be channeling Jesus' message if you want to consider it a pure message. So they would have had to have the ability of channeling. St. Paul would have had the ability to channel God's message through him to come up with a pure message that wasn't from him, from a human being, but it had to be a channeled message. So this is something that I think all Christians should think about. This is within their own teaching. It's agreed upon teaching, I think, within all various Christian churches, that a lot of this information had to be what would be considered channeled through to get it right, to get it to be speaking Jesus' voice through someone else. So this is something, if they could do it back then, again, you have these spiritual beings like Jesus who can transcend time. You have these multi-dimensional beings, and they're not bound by the laws of time and space, and they can come through people, they can visit people. You have these angels, you have spiritual masters in other traditions. There's a long history in our human experience, in our spiritual human experience, where people, ordinary people, are able to channel through them great works of spiritual importance. So I think this is very important to remember here. This is actually doctrine. It's Christian doctrine that I'm talking about here. People having the ability to connect to Jesus directly and his message to come through them. And this is documented through many saints that have come afterwards in the Christian tradition. So this is a worldwide phenomenon I think that Christians need to learn and open up to, because it's a part of your heritage. It's part of Jesus' story. It's part of his life work. And it's part of the greater spiritual story all of us share. And going on from there, these works, these great works, existed by word of mouth for some period of time. I think it was about 100 years. I don't know if there's any controversy about that. But it took a long time before the Bible was originally written down. And it says in a variety of places it was written in multiple languages. It was written in Hebrew, of course, which Jesus would have spoken. It was written in Greek, and it was also written in Aramaic. So there you have these three fairly different languages that were used quite commonly at this time. And again, the Bible was eventually written in Latin and then translated to many other languages. So in terms of my own personal experience with this type of work, having written books and having my wife edit them, and also seeing books within our spiritual mission that go out in various languages, various teachings that have to be translated in various languages. It's a very complicated process. And the person who's a really good translator has to really connect to the author, whether the author has been dead for a number of centuries or if the author is even a living person. The translator has really got to have some sort of spiritual connection with that person to get the translation right. Again, you have this idea of sort of interdimensional contact. For those people who translated the Bible into various languages, if they did an authentic job and they really represented Jesus' teachings accurately, because a lot of languages you can't translate it word for word. You have the meaning of words are different, and the way that the language are structured, you can't take one language and just take all the words and put it into another language. You have to sort of get into the author's mind and heart and really breathe in the book and really make it become sort of a living organism. And the translator has to be very careful about this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as we go through this more of the history of the Bible here. So from there, it said in a variety of places that there was as many as 40 different authors of the Bible. Of course, it's been rewritten and it's been retranslated. Also, there's a variety of different books. It's not one cohesive book. Of course, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. But within the Bible itself, and maybe people want to leave comments about this, and there's people who know more about this than I do, but there's all these various books that are put together. And of course, there's a variety of different authorships. And this went around for, I guess, 1,500 years. I found this great timeline and I read through that. And then there's other conflicting stories. But the Bible went through many, many different transformations. Of course, the church has changed hands in different ways, and the church has gone in different directions. And so there's lots of places here for this so-called Illuminati, for these worm-tongued individuals to come into the organization and change things. Because there was all these instances where the Bible went through a transformation. And every time that happened, this dark entity, this Illuminati type organization, had a major opportunity to insert themselves and insert their teachings into the Bible and to change the Bible around for their own personal gain, for the gain of their organization. And again, I've talked about this over and over again. It's all about power and control with these type of sociopathic personalities, with these type of abusive personalities. They have to control everything. Because if things run their natural course, if people are able to connect to the God within them, and I'm going to say this over and over throughout this video, if they're able to breathe in and be a part of the creation and everyone feels as one, there's no place for these negative entities. These negative personality types live by coercing people away from their natural higher powers, their natural connection to the divinity within them, their natural connection to their families and their community, their natural connection to nature. They have to take people away from their higher nature and bring them down to where they're very materialistic, where they're very selfish, what we see today in modern society. People who are very entitled, who think about their own personal wants and desires over their loved ones, over the other people in the world, a very competitive world where everybody's divided. They lose the ability to love. I talk about this over and over in my videos. You can see that so much now with how much these dark agencies, these secret societies, these demonic entities, this satanic type organization is bringing people away from the God within them. And this happened through their control of religions. And I think most of my Christian brothers and sisters, especially the people that would watch my videos, are aware that there has been moments in the Christian history, dark moments, not just in the Catholic religion, but many of these other religions where there's been pedophiles, where there's been ritualistic abuse, where there's been all kinds of negative, devilish type activities within the Christian religion. So you already know that the Illuminati, this what I'm calling the Illuminati, these dark secret entities, this worm-tongue type individuals, penetrated into the Christian tradition in a variety of different historical periods. So this was something that has happened, and people know this has happened. So again, I'm trying to say This is something where you have to really work towards creating your own personal relationship with God, with Jesus. You're really connecting on a soul level, on a heart level. You're working on yourself, you're purifying your thoughts so you can become more subtle, a more subtle being, and you can make this sort of connection and make an inner connection to the God within you, to Jesus in your heart, whatever you want to call it, that you're praying to God directly and you're looking for guidance. So there's a few other ways that you can see where the Illuminati penetrated into and distorted Jesus' teaching and manipulated the Christian religion. Because Jesus taught directly to people. He didn't have one set of teachings for his disciples. He didn't say, withhold information from everybody else. Do you see this? Do you see that this was the way that he taught? He taught to everybody, and then when the disciples took his information and brought it out to people, they taught the same information to everybody. They didn't withhold information, and they weren't supposed to. And then you see throughout the tradition of the church, there was only a few people who were allowed to read and interpret the Bible. And this was a very big problem. This happened with Martin Luther, I know, is one example of someone who really didn't want this. He wanted every household to have a Bible, for example. He was someone trying to reform the church. And the reason why they had to reform the church is because these dark entities, these power-hungry beings, have worked their way into this organization because they sought power and they sought privilege, and they thought by piggybacking, by being a parasite on Jesus' teachings, this would be a good way to get this. They had done this over and over within royal houses, within royalty, within governments, and other religious traditions. It's something they know how to do. They've worked out a system. They've worked out a scam. Now they have the debt-based money system on top of controlling all the major religions, on top of controlling all of the governments. They bribe people, they put puppets into place. They have these worm-tongued individuals controlling these puppets, infusing them with all this dark energy, whispering all this dark energy into their spiritual systems and poisoning their will and poisoning the will of the people. And now, so many years later, we have all this technology, kids spending 7.5 hours on the internet. They have all this subliminal messaging, TV and the flicker rate, and all these difficult, negative electromagnetic vibrations that these kids are undergoing. So you can see a progression. You can see how these secret organizations have created this template and created this energetic pattern which individuals come into material physical life, they come into human form, and they're able to continuously suck the goodness out of the human condition and turn all the people away from their higher selves, from their internal connection to the divinity within them, and bring out and pull out all the negative qualities, all the negative character qualities, all the lower tendencies of the masses, of all the people that inhabit Earth, to bring them down to a lower vibrational level. And this is how they're able to take control and keep control of the planet. Again, if nature is going to run its natural course, people will eventually rise up and connect to the God within them, connect to a higher level of being in themselves. Their character qualities are going to get better. They're not going to be able to be bribed as easily. They're going to actually aspire to be better beings, and this dark entities, this dark force, will have to leave the planet. There'll be no place for them. There'll be nothing here for them to catch hold of, because people will be too high above that level of that vibrational level, that negative level, to come down and wallow in their murky, malevolent presence. So going back to the Bible and talking about the different way it has changed over the years, it's really important, I think, for Christians to think about this, because the Bible, again, was not written by Jesus Christ. It flowed through his disciples, and over a period of 2,000 years, it passed through a variety of different people. And you can see the differences here, because it makes a big deal if you change one word here and if you change one word there. I found this great website because I was doing some research about this. So the website, I believe, is called the Bible Hub, and they just do a great job of comparing and contrasting the various teaching Jesus' teachings and how they're represented in these various Bibles. There's a lot of different Bibles out there. And this is from the King James Version. Neither shall they say, Lo here or Lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. That's from Luke 17, and then they have the version and the commentary. So they do a nice job. This is from the New American Standards Bible. Nor will they say, Look here it is, or there it is, for behold, the kingdom of God is in your midst. So there's a huge difference there. Do you see this? Between saying the kingdom of God is within you and saying the kingdom of God is within your midst. You can see that they mean two entirely different things. So which version of the Bible is right? And then you get into another separate little issue here, which I find throughout my YouTube videos when people comment on them. Even when you have conversations with people, I think most of you have probably experienced this sometime in your lifetime, where you're talking to people and you're just not able to communicate. Like I said, there's comments that come in all the time from my YouTube videos and can't for the life of me understand how the person generated their conclusion from the video that I put out there. How they generated, how this comment what got created from the video. And you see this all the time. Our understanding of words and ideas is different all throughout our country and all throughout the world. And even our own understanding grows and changes as you get older. I know if I watch some of my YouTube videos when I was a much younger person, I might have a very negative reaction and might wholeheartedly disagree with my older version of myself. So all of these things are subject to flux and change. So again, I'm really trying to emphasize the need for people to connect to Jesus directly, to connect to the source, because if you can read the Bible with your heart, you can read it from a spiritual place, the ideas will flow through you in a different way, and you'll be able to derive the actual meaning. If you can have conversations with people with your heart and really try to penetrate and look beyond the superficial veneer, the walls and the shields that all people put up in front of them, the boundaries from living in a very difficult and hostile world, their own psychological deficiencies, and you can penetrate to a deeper level. You can gain compassion into people. So there's a real need for this now in this day of age, and that's is why this video is being created. I want to move on to this other quote, Jesus' famous quote, "Don't hide your light under a bushel." Now I found this in a couple of different places. There's various times this quote is referenced in various chapters in the Bible. This one is from Mark 21, and this is from the King James Bible, and he says, "And he said unto them, Is a candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not set on a candlestick?" And this is from the New American Standard Bible. "And he was saying to them, A lamp is not brought to be put under a basket, is it? Or under a bed? Is it not brought to be put on a lampstand?" And this is from the New International Version. "He said to them, Do you bring in a lamp to put under a bowl or a bed? Instead, don't you put it on its stand?" So I found this all very interesting. It wasn't something I was aware of until I started to do this research. But there is this change. There is these various versions, and they do mean very different things. I'm sure people who know the Bible better than I do will have a better understanding of this. They'll have a better understanding of the various versions and the various teachings. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of my own spiritual practice, it feels very right to me when I look at Jesus' teaching, when I look at his body of work, that he believed that the kingdom of God was within people, and that he also believed that you shouldn't hide your light under a bushel, that you should allow the divine light that is within you to shine. And so I'm going to take these two teachings and talk about how the Illuminati basically did a lot of work to block these teachings, to block all Christians' access to these teachings. So what Christians would do in practice would be far different from what Jesus originally taught to them. You know, I've had a few people leave comments and said, "Are you a God-fearing man?" and they were very nicely put, and I appreciated the warmth in which the people left these comments. They weren't hostile comments, but it made me upset for them because this idea of fearing God, being a God-fearing person, is exactly the opposite of what Jesus taught. And so what the Illuminati did to take people away, just that I'm going through just these two simple teachings, and there's probably many more teachings that they twisted and inverted. Like I said in many of my other videos, it's always the satanic way, the way of the satanic people, of the demonic people, to invert things. They invert crosses, they turn the crosses upside down, they twist everything and turn it around, they turn it upside down, trying to point the power downwards and use the power on the lower level instead of pointing the power up where they connect it to God and the divinity that resides within all beings throughout the universe. They point it down towards our lower tendencies, towards our senses, towards our more animalistic, brutal nature. So they're trying to invert something so they can suck the power out of it and turn the power into something dark. So what's coming to me, what I'm receiving in terms of the main teachings, Jesus' main teachings that the Illuminati, these dark entities, these worm tongue type characters, twisted and inverted. The first one I already talked about was they made God something to fear. They said God is not God of love, God is somebody that you fear. And I'm going to talk more about that later on in the video. The second thing they did was to make people believe that they were sinners by nature, that they were evil by nature, that human beings by their very nature are evil. So think about this. If Jesus is teaching that God is within you, the kingdom of heaven is within you, and Jesus is appealing to people's higher levels, their higher nature, and many people within the Christian faith believe that God is love, and God is within everything, and God is part of everything, and God created the universe. Do you see the logic of this? If we're saying that God created the universe and created everything, we're all connected to God, and we're all a part of God. And yes, human beings have lower tendencies. We see this all around us. We see the negative energy, the negative emotions, the negative attitudes, the selfishness. I cover this quite extensively in many of my videos. We see the dark side of human beings, but we also must acknowledge, which Jesus acknowledged and Jesus talked about, that we also have a higher nature. So to just make people think that they are sinners, that immediately gives the devil a stranglehold on all the people that are following these teachings. The people that believe that human beings are sinners and that they're evil by nature, then you're already predisposed to follow Satan's path, to follow the demonic path, to be led away by worm tongue. It's really a very despicable thing if you think about it. You have this spiritual individual, this person who attains a very high spiritual level, and he's infusing all of his disciples and the people around him with love, and they're feeling God's love, and it's beginning to wake up God's love within them. They're starting to become more loving themselves. They're starting to connect to the divinity within them. He's giving them these brilliant teachings, and then his teachings are twisted around and inverted in a very satanic way, and people are taught who will have a connection to his teachings that they're sinners by nature, and they're already meditating on a very bad thing. They're thinking over and over about sins. I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner. And so what do you think they're going to act like? What do you think people are going to do when they have that? So you can see where the Illuminati have done a very, very bad thing here. You have all these sincere people who are sincerely trying to follow Jesus' teachings, but they're not able to connect to the higher part of themselves. Yes, human beings do commit sins. Yes, human beings do go against the will of God and go against the will of their souls. But for people to believe at a very nature that their souls are actually dark beings, that their souls aren't a part of God and connected to God, it's just blasphemy. It's complete evil. It's completely satanic. And I really hope, my Christian brothers and sisters, I'm begging you, please try to connect to Jesus and think about this. If you're having trouble with this, if you're in disagreement with this, is it something that you grew up with your whole life, that God is something to be feared, and that by your very nature you're a sinner, that you're an evil person, please pray to Jesus directly or pray to God directly. Pray for a number of nights. Pray until you get some sort of clarification or answer, and ask them if what I'm telling you is right. What's being said here, what's being presented in this video is right. And from these two teachings, that God is a being that's to be feared, and that by your very nature you're a sinner, you're evil by your very nature. I get a lot of comments in my videos about people saying you shouldn't open up your heart. They talk about all these esoteric practices and yoga and these types of things, and say when you open up your heart, you let evil in. And so again, going back to Jesus' quote about don't let your light hide under a bushel, what he's talking about is the light in your heart. I know this 100%. That you have light in your heart. You have God in your heart. And to allow God to work in your life, you have to open up your heart. And you have to become a more sensitive being. And you have to become a more loving being. And yes, when you do open up your heart, evil will get in. Everything will get in. If you open up a door, good things will come in and bad things will come in. But the only way for you to become a more divine person, to become a better version of yourself, is to open up your heart and allow the God to flow in it, and then he can wipe out all the negative tendencies that you already possess that are in your heart, as well as anything that might enter into your heart. But when you cut off, when you close the window, and you're still going to get evil into your heart through the television, through the internet, through other people. There's evil everywhere in this world, and you're going to pick up evil. It's like saying, I'm going to close myself off from the antidote, from the cure, but I'm still going to go out into an infected area and breathe in all the germs. You're going to get evil in your heart, but as long as the Illuminati, or you allow the Illuminati to disconnect you from the God within your heart, then there's no way to kill the evil. There's no way to cleanse yourself of all of these negative tendencies and all of this negative information that we're getting bombarded with. You have to open your heart. You have to let fresh air. It's like, there's some stagnant air in a house where the windows have never been opened. Yes, things might come in. You might get some spiders. You might get a wasp. You might get something bad that comes in if you open up your windows, but you're going to get sunlight. You're going to get a nice breeze. You're going to get fresh air. You're going to add oxygen. You're going to feel stronger. You're going to become more natural. You're going to become healthier. You'll be able to clean your environment. You'll have the strength to clean your environment because you're going to connect to your divine source. And when you do that, it's very easy to throw the evil out of your system. It's when we get tired, when we get worn down, when we spend too much time on the computer, we spend too much time in a negative environment, we cut ourselves off to our divine inner nature, we cut ourselves off from the natural world around us, then we're taken to a dark place. We become depressed, we become weak. Look at King Theoden again, and Wormtongue whispering evil into his ears. That's what we become. This weak individual that doesn't have the strength, who thinks and sees everything as being evil because the evil forces have twisted all the spiritual teachings that were given to humanity, given to humankind to turn our lives around. This has happened over and over in various religions throughout the world, where a spiritual being has come down here and given these great divine teachings that can only help and benefit people. And this Illuminati group, this dark secret organization, penetrates into the religion and inverts a lot of the things that end up weakening people, and it brings the darkness into people's hearts. It brings the darkness into the religion, and people are cut off from the original intent, the original source of these incredible teachings. All right, so there's a few more pieces with this. The other teaching was that the only way to get to God is through the Christian religion. I hear this over and over in comments to me, and I just needed to say something about this, because one of the things that the Illuminati desperately wants to do is separate people, is to divide and conquer. We see this with not only religions, but with countries, by race, by any way that they can divide people to get people fighting amongst themselves is a way they get to control the human species. They get to them to motivate for these countries to build weapons. Wars are a horrible thing. Horrible things happen in wars, and these dark entities that feed off of negative energy feast when they create wars. When you have these religious wars, when you have people trying to force their belief systems on other people, this is not what Jesus was about. He never once said anything about force your ideology on other people, about fight wars in my name. Think about how he would feel about this. Think about how any of these spiritual leaders would feel about this. So take in consideration these three twisted teachings. The first one, that God is something that we have to fear. Number two is that you are evil and a sinner by nature. And number three, that the only way to get to heaven is through this particular practice, that all the other people in the world are doomed and their religions are wrong and their belief systems are wrong. Now, all of this comes from, now this is going to be the most controversial point in this video. I hesitate to say it. I have my orders from within, and it's something that I feel like needs to be said. Now, if you look at Jesus' teaching and what I originally said in the beginning of this video, how I understand Jesus' teaching from my own life, from my own spiritual practice, is that he transcended his religion. He started off as a Jewish person, and he found a spiritual path, and he rose above his religion. He graduated from his religion. And when he did this, the people who ran his religion did not embrace him and see him for the beautiful spiritual being that he became. They did not see him for all that he had accomplished on the spiritual field and said, "Oh my God, look at you. You're incredible. Let's change the religion and put you at the head of this religion." Okay, you see this? They didn't embrace him. They didn't recognize him. In fact, they saw him as an enemy. They saw him as something that was threatening their power and position, because the Jewish religion had gone through what the Christian religion has now gone through. The Illuminati had infiltrated into the Jewish religion. You can see it by the description of the state of the religion, that Jesus was overturning the money tables in the church. And what they did when Jesus started to speak out and said this church is corrupt, this organization is corrupt, they plotted to take his life, because the dark forces, the dark agents had already penetrated and taken control of that religion. He was seen as competition. He was seen as a threat also by the Roman government. And we see this is what led to them plotting against him and wanting to take his life. So here's the controversial part. Now, Jesus, like I said, he brought in a new teaching. It wasn't a continuation of the Jewish tradition. He brought in a whole new darshan, is what they would call it in India. He brought in a whole new level of teaching. It was a different consciousness. If you look at the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's a completely different book. God is described in a completely different way. The God in the Old Testament and the God that Jesus describes in the New Testament are completely different. They're not the same being. They're not talked about. They don't have the same qualities. They don't have the same essence. You Christians could be able to see this. You people have read the Bible over and over again. If you read it with fresh mind and fresh eyes, you would see that we're talking about a totally different being in both books. My wife's and I goal for our children in terms of homeschooling them was that we wanted to give them a broad perspective of all of the different religions around the world. My wife has gotten a good portion of our homeschooling curriculum. A lot of our homeschooling curriculum comes from the Christian tradition, and we really are grateful to our Christian brothers and sisters. We've met some of them who were the the pioneers of the homeschooling movement. They got all the laws changed. They came up with a lot of these great curriculums, a lot of things on character development and family life. A lot of the things that we learned about in terms of homesteading came from our Christian brothers and sisters. We wouldn't have been able to really homeschool our children if Christian people hadn't pioneered the homeschooling movement. And a lot of our curriculum, a lot of what we've taught our children comes from the Christian tradition. And we also have studied, like I said, as much as we can of the major religions. And at one point, my wife read to my children and myself the Old Testament. And I actually looked forward to reading it. I remember reading it as a kid. I liked a lot of the stories in the book. And I look forward to my children learning these stories that I learned as a child. And we read the Old Testament. We were all shocked at how they portrayed God in this book. It's quite different from what we believe, especially my children who have been taught all their lives that God is love and you connect to the God within you. And you had this being who was very much like the devil. If you look at how God is presented in the Old Testament, he is presented like the devil. He is envious, he is jealous, he is extraordinarily petty, he punishes people he's way over the top in terms of his punishments. There was so much there. My kids were reacting throughout the book, and they were saying, look at this and look at that. And it just was basically describing an Illuminati type being, a very narcissistic, a very selfish, a very angry, all the negative qualities that people possess. And then you look at the New Testament and how Jesus presents God and how Jesus acted himself, a very loving, a very compassionate being who weeps for people, who suffers for people, who sacrifices for people, who lives a very selfless life, who does everything that he can to build other people up and connect them to God, who is always giving of himself. Again, this idea of the crucible, of the cross, where his arms are spread out and the love is pouring out of his chest to all of humanity. He's connecting deep to his Father within his heart. I mean, just the opposite, the total opposite version of way the God is presented in the Old Testament. I don't know how much the Old Testament is like the Torah. I don't know exactly. I've never read the Torah. I don't know how much it's like the authentic teachings that you have in the Jewish tradition. But if the Torah is like the Old Testament, and what the people are doing there is worshiping a dark entity. They're worshiping a demonic entity. The God that's presented in the Old Testament is like Baphomet or Beelzebub or the devil or something, some sort of worm tongue type individual, a very low individual. I mean, these are the character qualities and these are the characteristics that are being presented there. This is a really important point. I want to re-emphasize this point. This is probably the most important point in this video. What group of people do you think would have a vested interest in teaching you that God is to be feared, that God is going to punish you, that you should be scared of God, that God is not within you, and that you are in a sense evil? Your very essence is evil. What group would want to do that to you? It would only be what we call the Illuminati, these satanic worshippers, people that have willingly, people in dark souls and dark spirits that have willingly disconnected themselves from God. Do you see this? They don't want you to connect to God. All major religions, all spiritual organizations teach that God created the universe, that God is a part of the universe. That the universe is a part of God, that every particle, every being is a part of God, that we're all connected to God. Why would God want to punish himself, especially when we say God is love? Why would God be jealous? Who could God be jealous of? There's no jealousy in pure love. So this kind of teaching goes exactly against what we all know to be the true nature of God. And if we really go deep and think about it, it's the true nature of each one of us. As we're all part of the source, we all can return to the source. And God is lovingly trying to bring us back to the source. And you can see that whenever a person has graduated out of their religion and brought in a new set of teachings, brought in a new religious movement. There was a separation between the old religious movement and the new religious movement. You wouldn't have the Old Testament and the New Testament slammed together as one cohesive book, because Jesus brought in a whole different way of what he was taught as a young person in the Jewish tradition. He had already seen that the Jewish religion had been compromised. It had been infiltrated by these dark forces, and he was saying, no, we have to go in a different direction. God is love. God is in your heart. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Open up your heart and allow God to flow in and allow your light to flow out to other people. Do what I am doing. There are very many similarities to a yogic practice. A yogic practice is about union with God. A lot of people think that yoga is stretching and it's about opening up the chakras. In Hatha yoga they do that, but there are a lot of yoga practices that are just about connecting to the divinity within you. There's this famous yogic saint. His name is Yogananda. It's not the person that I follow or the path that I follow, but this person says that Jesus taught a very similar yogic practice to what he taught, and this person's written a whole book on it. He's a very famous person in India and throughout the world. I believe he's passed away now, but he drew a lot of comparisons to the yogic principles that he taught and what Jesus taught. But so when we're going back to this idea that they slammed these two books together, they slammed Jesus' teachings with the teachings that he was preaching against and that he himself had transcended, and that's where you get a lot of these negative ideas have infiltrated into Jesus' teachings. They linked an organization that had already been compromised, that had already been infiltrated, with Jesus' new teachings and his new organization, plus all the organizations of governments that were intertwined with the church over the years and all these individuals. And so this is where they started to teach things that were inaccurate, that would have upset Jesus if people had said those things in his day, if they had twisted his teachings around and he was able to witness that. All right, I think I got to wrap this video up. It's going a lot longer than I originally thought. I don't know if I'll ever make a follow-up video to this. It's a very delicate subject matter. Again, I'm dedicating this video to my Irish Catholic mother who just passed away, and to all the great things that I've received in my upbringing within the Christian tradition, and also to Jesus and his great teachings and his noble work for many, many years, and the many Christian brothers and sisters who participate in my videos and leave comments and support our channel. This is something that I felt like was my duty. A lot of these comments resonated with me in a way that I felt like I need to share some information that I think maybe might be helpful. And again, the main point of these videos, this video is about, and all my videos, is about connecting to the God within you. I think this is the answer. I think when people connect to the God within them, I know this is the answer. When people all around the world connect to the God within them, you will see a complete transformation of the world. You will see a complete transformation of the human condition and the human species. So my Christian brothers and sisters, I pray that you connect to the God within you. I pray that you pray directly to Jesus and think about these things that are said in this video. See if they resonate with you on a heart-based level, and see if you can find some way to have Jesus connect to you and read the Bible with your hearts and read his teachings as a living being, as you're connected to a living being that can connect with you, can give you what you need, can bring you up to a higher state of consciousness. I pray that this happens. I pray that you're all able to do this. And I pray that this video has a positive effect on all the people that watch it. These works, these great works, existed by word of mouth for some period of time. I think it was about 100 years. I don't know if there's any controversy about that. But it took a long time before the Bible was originally written down. And it says in a variety of places it was written in multiple languages. It was written in Hebrew, of course, which Jesus would have spoken. It was written in Greek, and it was also written in Aramaic. So there you have these three fairly different languages that were used quite commonly at this time. And again, The Bible was eventually written in Latin and then translated to many other languages. So in terms of my own personal experience with this type of work, having written books and having my wife edit them, and also seeing books within our spiritual mission that go out in various languages, various teachings that have to be translated in various languages. It's a very complicated process. And the person who's a really good translator has to really connect to the author, whether the author has been dead for a number of centuries or if the author is even a living person. The translator has really got. So as I started doing some research on the history of the Bible, I found it extremely interesting. It's very compelling, and it's a very controversial subject. I found there's a variety of camps and a variety of different stories, so I'm just going to give a general synopsis about how the history of the Bible applies to this narrative. And really, if you think about it, if you look through the history of the Bible, which I kind of knew going into it, it's a book that has changed forms and changed content many times. So it's important to remember that the Bible itself was not written by Jesus. It passed through a variety of conduits, Jesus' disciples, various members of his original 12 disciples, and St. Paul. And St. Paul, if you remember, he was a Jewish soldier who was in charge of slaughtering Christians, and he was on his way on the road to Damascus, and he had a spiritual awakening. And he was knocked from his horse by God, and he had this spiritual experience. And more than any other disciple, and this I'm sure it's controversial within the Christian community, he was responsible for building and creating the Christian church the way it is today. He had a lot of influence on the Christian church, and some of his works are included in the Bible, and he had never physically met Jesus Christ. So it's important to know, even in this early phase of the Christian teachings, part of it came through, or all of it came through, a variety of conduits, other parties, who had to be channeling Jesus' message if you want to consider it a pure message. So they would have had to have the ability of channeling. St. Paul would have had the ability to channel God's message through him to come up with a pure message that wasn't from him, from a human being, but it had to be a channeled message. So this is something that I think all Christians should think about. This is within their own teaching. It's agreed upon teaching, I think, within all various Christian churches, that a lot of this information had to be what would be considered channeled through, to get it right, to be speaking Jesus' voice through someone else. So this is something, if they could do it back then, again, you have these spiritual beings like Jesus who can transcend time. You have these multi-dimensional beings, and they're not bound by the laws of time and space, and they can come through people, they can visit people. You have these angels, you have spiritual masters in other traditions. There's a long history in our human experience, in our spiritual human experience, where people, ordinary people, are able to channel through them great works of spiritual importance. So I think this is very important to remember here. This is actually doctrine. It's Christian doctrine that I'm talking about here. People having the ability to connect to Jesus directly and his message to come through them. And this is documented through many saints that have come afterwards in the Christian tradition. So this is a worldwide phenomenon I think that Christians need to learn and open up to, because it's a part of your heritage. It's part of Jesus' story. It's part of his life work. And it's part of the greater spiritual story all of us share. And going on from there, these got to have some sort of spiritual connection with that person to get the translation right. Again, you have this idea of sort of interdimensional contact. For those people who translated the Bible into various languages, if they did an authentic job and they really represented Jesus' teachings accurately, because a lot of languages you can't translate it word for word. The meaning of words are different, and the way that the language are structured, you can't take one language and just take all the words and put it into another language. You have to sort of get into the author's mind and heart and really breathe in the book and really make it become sort of a living organism. And the translator has to be very careful about this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as we go through this more of the history of the Bible here. So from there, it's said in a variety of places that there was as many as 40 different authors of the Bible. Of course, it's been rewritten and it's been retranslated. Also, there's a variety of different books. It's not one cohesive book. Of course, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. But